for the now almost, well, over 3 years since the incident, to have the Defense Department still taking the position that this should be treated as normal workforce violence or something to that effect.
Well, gentlemen, you.
Yes, I will yield.
I think it's particularly interesting that this determination by the Army came, or by our military leaders came, here in December. We just observed, wasn't a celebration, we observed the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. As my friend, as you, Judge Carter, pointed out numerous times, the victims of the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon have been recognized as victims of warfare. They were attacked by the same, or by people of the same belief as is Major Hassan, that he secures a place in paradise if he's killed while killing infidels like his soldier friends. In fact, those soldiers that he was also hired to counsel as a counselor at Fort Hood, a local imam for Fort Hood. And yet one cannot help but wonder if these same folks who declared the deaths at the hands of a Muslim extremist at Fort Hood, if these same people in charge today had been in charge on December 7th, 1941, then there is nothing to indicate their reasoning would have been different. All of those soldiers killed at Pearl Harbor, those entombed in the Arizona, those killed in that horrific surprise attack, actually, they were at their duty stations, they were at work, and someone came and killed them. Therefore, apparently under the reasoning as applied at Fort Hood, those killed at Pearl Harbor could also be considered as having been killed in workplace violence. It was violent, it was their workplace, therefore our mental geniuses that decided Fort Hood was workplace violence could say that about Pearl Harbor. I yield back.
And don't you wonder, have we changed so much since the attack on Pearl Harbor that we don't recognize an enemy attack on us, and we just want to stick our head in the sand and act like it didn't happen? Here's an interesting report from Time magazine. They're asking the question. They state the U.S. military just released a report. This is that first report. Not once mentioning Major Hassan's name, discussing whether the killings may have had anything to do with his Muslim faith. The report ignores the elephant in the room. That's what I said. And it's true. It does ignore the elephant in the room. If before the first bullet was fired, the man shouts, Allah Akbar, that elephant's in the room. And all the cover-up and all the writing of reports with references to typical workforce violence or standard workforce violence or treated as workforce violence, it doesn't make sense. It was an attack on American soldiers in uniform. I'll yield back.
Well, thank you. And
next one.
With regard to that very issue, we know that in the 9/11 Commission there were hundreds of mentions of Islam, jihad, all these type things that we know were involved. And again, we thank God that the vast majority of Muslims love this country like we do. They're not about to kill Christians, Jews, but there are those in the radical element that believe otherwise. We ought to be able to talk about it. We now know that this administration has seen to such a purging of our training material for Defense Department, intelligence, state, that in the current lexicon from which FBI, our intelligence folks, are trained, there are 0 mentions of Islam, 0 mentions of jihad, 0 mention of the very things that created the worst attack on American soil in American history. As one of our own officers told me, we have been blinded in this war with those using terrorism. We're not allowed to see our enemy. We're not allowed to describe our enemy. We're not allowed to talk about who the real enemy is. We're just expected to protect America with our eyes closed and our mouths shut. That's no way to protect America. I yield back to my friend.
This exhibit here is from the San Francisco Chronicle. Political correctness on Fort Hood at the Pentagon. Political correctness is alive in the Pentagon. Witness the Protecting the Force lessons from Fort Hood. A Department of Defense report released last week on November the 5th, on the November the 5th shooting. If the report's purpose was to call lessons, to craft lessons to prevent future attacks, how could they leave out radical Islam? Ignoring Hassan's pro-terrorist web postings, the report instead focuses on workplace violence programs to prevent workplace violence, such as the post office's Going Postal program and the stress imposed on military health care providers. The whole point of that San Francisco Chronicle article is to point out, I think, the irony of what we're teaching our soldiers to protect them from events like this and what we're excluding from the evidence. And I think that's blatantly not in the best interest of the soldier.
The gentleman, you?
Yes.
There is an article dated February 9th, 2010 in the Washington Times by Bill Gertz that says Army warned about jihadist threat in 2008. It says almost 2 years before the deadly Fort Hood shooting by a radicalized Muslim officer, the U.S. Army was explicitly warned that jihadism, Islamic holy war, was a serious problem and threat to personnel in the U.S., according to participants at a major Army-sponsored conference. It references Patrick Poole, Army Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Myers, and Terry Wonder as individuals that participated. It says the shooting at a recruiting center in Little Rock, Arkansas in June and the November shooting at Fort Hood, Texas that killed 13 people have exposed the problem of the Army's deficiencies in understanding the nature of the domestic Islamic terrorist threat, Mr. Poole said. The incidents have raised questions about whether the Army made any effort to operationalize the threat warnings from the 2008 conference and develop policies to counter the threats. The answer quite clearly is no, Mr. Poole said. And then it goes on to discuss this whole problem. And Mr. Poole said, I noted because of our lack of understanding of Islamic doctrines, Islamic jihad, and my view that our counterintelligence function is broken, outdated, being usurped in some cases by public affairs and equal opportunity officials, we were going to get soldiers killed in America on our own basis for that professional ignorance. This is the kind of thing that should not be happening. This article was in 2010 before at least 2 other individuals had gone on Al Jazeera in uniform blasting our military and indicating they could not ever be deployed in a Muslim area. And it's also worth noting that the term Islamophobe that I'm sure is being generated right now about the 2 of us here talking about this issue actually originated with the Organization of Islamic Conference, the OIC, they came up with the term Islamophobia, Islamophobe, and there is an ongoing effort to brand anybody who attempts to identify those by their beliefs who have gone about killing Americans, terrorizing Americans, as an Islamophobe or as, having Islamophobia. We know that there are places like Harvard where a professor from India who wrote an article about the attacks that are ongoing on his homeland in India by Muslim extremists and how that should be dealt with. He was fired because Islamic activists at Harvard do not believe we should have free speech anymore. And as I mentioned on this floor earlier this week, one of the 2005 10-year goals of the Muslim Brotherhood here in America is to subvert our Constitution to Sharia law by 2015. That effort is ongoing. And when they continue to brand professors, soldiers, intelligence officers as Islamophobes, and that we need laws to prevent people from describing radical jihadists who want to kill our own American people, as long as that's being done and that's being allowed, then our First Amendment rights are being subverted to Sharia law. We're well on our way to them meeting their 2015 goal. As more and more good folks have been won over into this idea, this thought that, gee, if you say anything about radical jihadists, radical Islamists, you're the sick one, you need to be stopped. This is an ongoing effort around the world, and we cannot allow it to overtake America. We should be able to recognize those wonderful patriotic Muslims in America for who they are, but we should also be able to recognize and talk about those who want to kill us and destroy our way of life for who they are. They're radical Islamic jihadists. Now you're back.
Thank you. You know, you just referenced in your poster and showed us a picture of the Mr. Abdo man that was saying he couldn't go to war. That was back in, what year was that?
2010.
Okay. December the 7th, 2011, after the workplace violence, I'm sorry, that's the wrong date. July the 28th of 2011, another soldier made the same claim that he was and Abdo was also referenced in this story. This is getting to be, the more and more of these folks are stepping up and saying they can't be deployed because they are Muslim and can't kill Muslims, and they reference Hassan, this man who's sitting in the Bell County Jail awaiting trial probably this spring, and as I understand it, awaiting trial on a death penalty case, or potential death penalty case. Everybody knew what it was when we attacked the Pentagon. What happened to us that we decided when they, in front of 50 witnesses, somebody shoots a bunch of people and we can't recognize what that was? This was a surprise attack like Pearl Harbor. That was a premeditated murder like you and I have dealt with in the past, with more witnesses than you could put on a stand. I mean, this is not going to be a hard case to prove because, unfortunately, he didn't kill everybody in the room. In fact, he left an awful lot of witnesses there to testify. He's just lucky he didn't get killed in the active shooter program that our two police officers used to respond effectively to his slaughter.
The gentleman,
I yield back.
Well, my friend the judge indicates he was lucky. Unfortunately, in his perverted way of thinking, that also is a way of thinking that confounded Thomas Jefferson when he was negotiating with the Islamic Barbary pirates. he actually believed that he would have gone to paradise and had dozens of virgins at his disposal if he had been killed. So he doesn't necessarily think of himself as lucky, nor would those in Iran, once a nuclear weapon or nuclear weapons are assuredly procured, be any different. They would believe if they were to go up with a nuclear weapon that they carried into some place where lots of Americans were or Israelis were, then they would be assured of instantly being transported to paradise. Some of us have a different view of what they would find when they meet their Maker after this life, and I think they're going to be terribly surprised. But our job and our oath is to our Constitution, is to provide for the common defense against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And when someone presents this kind of danger to our troops, it is just unfathomable that our military leaders would become so politically correct and so militarily neutered that they would not stand up for their own troops, for those whose care has been put under their service and attention. I yield back.
Thank you for yielding up. Mr. Gohmert, let me read to you a resolution, HRS 495, which I dropped yesterday, resolution recognizing November 5th, 2009 attack on Fort Hood, Texas as an act of radical Islamic terrorism and jihad. Whereas the United States Army Major Nidal Hasan is reported to have communicated on multiple occasions with radical Islamic terrorist Anwar Awlaki on the topic of justifying jihad on the United States and its armed forces, whereas Major Hassan delivered addresses to the Department of Defense personnel concerning the justification of jihad against the United States Armed Forces, whereas Major Hassan is reported to have planned and trained for an attack on unarmed members of the United States Armed Forces at Fort Hood, Texas, with the specific intent to kill and injure those troops before the deployment to overseas theaters of war, whereas Major Hassan is reported to have declared his attack to be an act of jihad in defense of Islam, shouting "God is great" in Arabic while gunning down unarmed military personnel and civilians, whereas Major Hassan is currently charged with murder of 13 and attempted murder of 32 United States citizens during that attack, and whereas the Department of Defense submitted correspondence to the United States Senate Committee on Homeland Security which referred to the violent Islamic extremist attack on Fort Hood, Texas, in the context of a broader threat of workplace violence. Now therefore be it resolved that the House of Representatives recognizes the attack on Fort Hood, Texas as an act of radical Islamic terrorism and jihad against the United States Armed Forces. I have submitted this to the House and I am going to be seeking support for this resolution. I wonder sometimes what our forefathers would think of how far we've gone out of kilter in recognizing who's our friend and who's our enemy. How we are so concerned about what the speak police or the voice police would say to us about some language we use, that we would be willing to put those men and women who wear the uniform of our armed services at risk rather than make a statement that might offend somebody. I think our grandparents would look at this country and say, what happened? What happened to the United States of America that I fought for in World War II or Korea or Vietnam? When did it become evil for Americans to speak the truth? Why would people who have 4 stars on their shoulder, who we highly respect as leaders of our armed services, tolerate being instructed in this concept of political correctness and be treating this as if it were an ordinary incident of workforce violence? How do we justify that? Where's the common sense in this effort? We're worried about hurting other people's feelings, and other people are killing us. I mean, this doesn't make any sense. And most of all, let's not forget, because I attended the funeral of one of the civilians. I have met with some of the wives and children of these dead combat soldiers, and talked to the parents and looked me in the eye and said, how do I figure this out? My kid was there to be deployed for the 4th time. He stood in harm's way for our country 3 years already. And he goes over to the deployment center for routine work of dealing with paperwork, and he gets attacked and killed in Texas, just right down the street from where he lives. And his children and his wife are without a brave American soldier who had proven his worth in combat in 3 deployments already. This is something that a parent sits there and says, how could anything like this ever happen? I mean, I know to be praying every day for my child when he's in combat. I expect, this is the profession he's chosen. I respect it. I fear for him. I worry about him. I want to make sure he or she, because our ladies are fighting just like our men. And now I get the word that my son is killed down the street from his kid's elementary school while he's going through a routine act of filling out paperwork in the Army. And then what do we tell that parent when later they find out that a report has come out from the government saying routine workforce violence? Come on. Come on. What's wrong with this? I think it's just tragic. And we just tried, when I started, I introduced a bill that just said, look, acknowledge it for what it is. Nothing will disrespect the Purple Heart or others who are wounded in a combat theater. To just acknowledge that these innocent people who got attacked on their way to their next deployment or on the way back from their last deployment on our soil, on our military base, in our state of Texas, at least give them the respect to acknowledge that they're part of the war effort. That this guy shot them because they were at war. We are at war with terrorists. Give them combat credit. Give them the honor and respect that comes from that. But we still are not able to get that done. We're going to keep trying. And I have people call me from all over the country and say, how are we doing? My kid at least ought to get a Purple Heart. My daughter ought to get a Purple Heart for the wound she received, and now she's debilitated and has to go out of the Army. My son, who's going through constant therapy for his head wound, he ought to be recognized by the Army for what happened to him, the reality of what happened to him. And so we won't make the easy acknowledgement that these folks were in combat, and the only reason they didn't fight this guy is because they were not armed. And the reason they were not armed is because you're not supposed to be armed on post. This guy attacks them. If they'd have been armed, it would have been over from the first bullet fired. These are combat veterans. But no, we are very strict. Oh, we're not going to change this designation the Army has or that designation the Army has. But we aren't going to call this guy a terrorist. Don't mention the words Islamic. Don't recognize his relationship with Islamic terrorists. Ignore all that evidence. Ignore the testimony of 50-some-odd witnesses and call it, we'll treat it within the concept of workforce violence. What does that say to the wife of that, or husband of that soldier, or the father or mother of that soldier, or the brother and sister of that soldier that was killed or wounded with a debilitating wound, many of which are still struggling with their wounds, just like they do in combat? And yet we conveniently define things in that situation, but refuse to define the act that caused the situation. Now, this just is not right. And that's why I'm very grateful my friend Mr. Gohmert and I came down here to talk about this. This is all about trying to just set the record straight. You know, let's call it like we see it. And let's don't think we have to protect anybody. And it has absolutely nothing to do with Muslim religion. If he was a Baptist and was shouting Baptist slogans and as his reason for shooting somebody, we ought to call him a Baptist. This is a tragedy. It's a terrible tragedy because these were soldiers, all of whom had been willing to go in harm's way on behalf of our country, and most of whom had gone in harm's way on behalf of our country, and suffered through that miserable weather and those dark, lonely nights, and all the other things that soldiers suffer through when they're addressing terrorism around the world. And I say around the world because we still got plenty of places we're addressing terrorism, not just Iraq and Afghanistan. And to have us be willing to soft pedal what happened to them is an American tragedy. And I'm going to continue to talk about it. Mr. Speaker, at this time I will yield back the balance of my time, and I thank you.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity this evening. I'm joined by my colleague from Ohio, Marcy Kaptur. I want to thank our colleague from Texas for the explanation he gave about the tragedy at Fort Hood. It was indeed an American tragedy, as were other acts of violence against this country, both within the country and around the world. No doubt that there is radical Islam. No doubt that it is killing not only Americans but others around the world. And it is part of our task to find an appropriate way to deal with it. It's also part of our task to appropriately recognize the tremendous sacrifice made by our soldiers, both here as in the Fort Hood incident and certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan. Today marks a very, very special day in American history. It is the end of one of the great American tragedies, and that is the war in Iraq. No matter how we may think of this today, I think we can be very confident that this war of choice was indeed a very bad choice. More than 4,000 Americans have been killed in this war, and perhaps several times that number injured. Physical injuries, we often see them just off the floor as these men and women return from their medical treatment at the Bethesda hospitals, and we mourn their physical loss. The mental problems that our veterans have occurred after multiple deployments in Iraq will go on for years, as will the physical injuries. Post-traumatic stress syndrome is a major, major problem among the thousands of veterans, or hundreds of thousands of veterans that have returned. These are issues that we must deal with, and as we mark today the final withdrawal of American troops from Iraq, our heart, our compassion, and indeed our actions go out to those veterans who have served this nation in this war. Whatever we may think of the war, we must always think well and appropriately of these soldiers, men and women, multiple tours, National Guard, the Reserves, and the Active Army, and Navy and Air Force and Marines, all serving this country. Many things have happened here on the floor to deal with those issues that they have incurred. Just 2 weeks ago, we passed major pieces of legislation that are a follow-up to earlier pieces of legislation for the veterans. The Democratic Congress in 2009 and 10 enacted the most far-reaching veterans benefits since the end of World War II. A new GI Bill is in place. Job opportunities and training are in place. Enhancement of the medical services through the Veterans Administration, and many other that were culminated last week, wrong word, not culminated, but added to last week with legislation that provides a very strong incentive for employers to hire unemployed veterans. The unemployment rate for veterans is generally twice as high as the average American unemployment rate. Those benefits go to the employer, reducing their taxes by $2,600 for every veteran they hire. If they hire a long-term unemployed veteran, it'll be $5,600, and if it happens to be one of the disabled veterans, perhaps one that we often see outside this chamber, then it's $9,600 reduction in the taxes for that employer. We hope employers all across this nation hear this and reach out to the veterans in their community and give them a job. The rest of the time we have tonight, I'd like to talk about jobs for Americans. As much as we may want to think about the wars, and today we passed the Defense Authorization Act, we have to also think about Americans here at home that need a job. We've been working for some time on a program that we call Make It in America, a rebuilding of the strength of the American manufacturing industry. Over the last 20 years, we have seen a rapid decline in the manufacturing base of America, because that's where the middle class found its place. That's where the middle class found their opportunity to use the skills, whatever training they may have, whatever education they may have, and get a good, solid job that would support a family. 20 million Americans were employed in manufacturing 20 years ago. Today it is just over 11 million, almost a 50% decline. We can't let this continue. We cannot allow the outsourcing of American jobs. We have to bring those jobs back home, and there are many ways that we can do that. And our Make It in America agenda by the Democratic Party here in Congress is taking root, and tonight we're going to talk about many parts of that. Joining me is Marcy Kaptur from Ohio, once and will be the heart of the American manufacturing sector. I know you have many pieces of legislation, and I know your intense passion on rebuilding the manufacturing sector in America. So let's talk about some of the things that are going on here in Congress and what we can do.
I want to thank Congressman Garamendi for, again, bringing us together to discuss the most important issue on the minds of the American people, and that is healing the economy here at home and producing a sufficient number of jobs to employ all Americans who want to work. And I join the Congressman's comments about our veterans, veterans who have served our country so bravely, a great sense of self-sacrifice and national sacrifice. We thank them, particularly during this holiday season, their families, their children, their relatives, their friends, their communities, all their employers, all of those who understand what this requires. And I wanted to just mention that in connecting our veterans coming home to the employment question, it's a very serious challenge that we face, because even in a state like Ohio, currently of all those who remain unemployed in Ohio, and there are many, 52,000 are veterans already. And it was correct, I think, for President Obama in going to visit with our veterans and active military at this holiday season, that one of the issues that came up repeatedly was, well, with our veterans coming home, where are they going to work? With so many unemployed already. And to give an example, in Ohio and many other parts of the country, for every job that exists, 100 people apply, or more, And even if we filled every job that exists, we would have millions of Americans still out of work. And yet, we have huge unmet national needs. And that's where making decisions here, both on the tax side and the spending side, to get our economic house in order and to rein in the abuses in the financial sector on Wall Street that have caused such damage here and abroad, are absolutely critical for us to deal with and to keep those at the top of our priority list. I think Congressman Garamendi and I agree that some of the partisan wrangling here is really so non-productive. And if you want to put the country back to work, that's what the debate should be about. We should have job thermometers here showing how well we're doing and how fast we are helping to grow this economy. So as with Congressman Garamendi's support of the Veterans Tax Credit for hiring, I obviously support that as well. But it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient because, as I understand it, the tax credit will yield about 40,000 openings around the country. 40,000 companies will hire maybe one worker, or however it will ultimately transpire. But we have a need to reinvest in America, and the most important factor in reinvestment is for our banks to have confidence and our people to have confidence that there's going to be stability in our economy. And I think the partisan wrangling really works against that. I think, wouldn't you agree, Congressman?
It really does. If I might take a moment here. You raised one of the very important points. I know later in this discussion you're going to take up this in much more detail. But it's very, very clear that the financial sector, in their rush for profit, created the housing bubble. Didn't do it all by themselves. There was plenty of greed on the part of certain people that bought houses, and the real estate community was involved in that, the mortgage community. But here we are after bailing out the Wall Street. What is Wall Street doing to bail out Main Street? Not much. Not much. I heard a discussion earlier today from a banker that said, oh, we're making all kinds of SBA loans. Yes, that's guaranteed. Those are loans guaranteed by the federal government. But what risk are they taking? We passed the Dodd-Frank legislation, which was designed to rein in Wall Street. Good, very good. As strong as I would like? No, I would go back and put in place the Glass-Steagall Act. I was the insurance commissioner before the Glass-Steagall Act disappeared, and insurance was over here and banks were over there and investment banking were separate, so that the kind of problem that existed in 2000, where the banks went berserk and crazy in greed, creating all these CDOs and other kinds of, really fake instruments. They couldn't do it. But nonetheless, the Dodd-Frank is there. Our Republican colleagues are refusing to fund the implementation of that program, putting all of us at risk once again. Let's move, and I want to go back to the manufacturing sector and some of the issues that arise there, and particularly the unemployment rate in your communities. Now, we have to reauthorize the unemployment insurance program. Otherwise, is it 3.3 million Americans are going to lose their unemployment insurance in the first of the year? And where you have such high unemployment as you do in your communities, what are they going to do? How are they going to feed their families, pay their mortgages? And when you provide an unemployment check, it immediately goes into the economy and creates $1.6 for every dollar of the check. And I know you see this in yours, and you've talked to me about the unemployment and the way in which the cessation of the unemployment insurance would just devastate people here at holiday season. So share with us what you were sharing just this earlier in the week when we were talking about this.
Well, Congressman Garamendi, the problem is when you have 100 people out there looking for a job, a given job, means 99 won't get it. And these are people who want to work. They have a record of working. They have actually collected their benefits. They've paid into the insurance fund for unemployment in their respective states. But when the economy doesn't recover as fast as it must, then what happens is after they use up their first 26 weeks of unemployment, what are they supposed to do? Where are they going to work in order to provide for their families? And we'd had to, at the federal level, extend unemployment because of this massive recession that we are digging out of. We've had to extend people. These are people who want to work, who have worked, who have a working record.
And continue looking for jobs.
So they continue looking for jobs, and I can tell you some of them have been looking for jobs for 3 and 4 years. It isn't that they don't want to work, but imagine you send out, and how many people have I talked to? They've sent out hundreds of resumes. They have gone door to door looking for work. They have tried, and yet the door keeps getting shut in their face. At some point, any human being begins to think there must be something wrong with me. There must be that I can't obtain work when they have a very good record. Many of them are doing 2 and 3 jobs just to bring income in, and then they're trying to look for a full-time job. It's very disruptive to family life. Many of them have moved in with their relatives now, and they shouldn't feel like failures. I've said to my audiences, back home, it isn't your fault. You didn't do this to America. The biggest banks failed us. They failed our country. They've hurt us. They created false money. Many of them became so rich that no normal person could even imagine what they're floating in. But it isn't the fault of the ordinary worker, so they shouldn't take it out. They shouldn't eat themselves up in self-agony, and there's a lot of that out there.
I see it in my own district in California. One of the things that we've been trying to do is to take up the President's call on this matter. The President, back in September, put forth the American Jobs Act. Many pieces of it, we'll talk about some of those pieces today, but in the American Jobs Act there was an extension of the unemployment insurance, which economists left, right, and center all say is the best way to stimulate, to keep the economy moving. And he suggested that we extend it for those who have been unemployed for 2 years or more. And I think it's the only humane and compassionate thing to do, particularly here at the holiday season. He also made the suggestion that we continue the payroll tax reduction, which was 2%, that is from 5.5% to 3.5%. He suggested that it go down to that the reduction be 3.1%. Now, we are as concerned as our Republican colleagues about the deficit. And the President is too, and he suggested that this needs to be paid for. We cannot borrow money from China to do the unemployment insurance or to do the payroll tax deduction. Now, the payroll tax deduction, it's rather important. It's over $1,500 in the pocket of every working person in this nation. That's an enormous amount of money for a person that's earning $10, $20 an hour. And so he wanted to do that. How is he going to pay for it? He suggested that we pay for this in what is called tax fairness, that we take the upper income, those people that have earned $1 million a year or more, and increase the tax that they pay over $1 million by 3.5%. A 3.5% increase above $1 million, not below, but above. Now, that's fairness because these folks have had an enormous tax reduction over the last decade, part of the Bush tax cuts. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and you and I have been here, and perhaps we ought to share with the public what happened yesterday when a bill came to the floor to provide unemployment insurance extension and a payroll tax deduction. It was really not a shining day for the House of Representatives. And we'll go into some detail here, but essentially what happened was that the legislation put forth by our Republican colleagues basically said, okay, we'll continue the payroll tax deduction, not at 3.1%, but at 2% reduction, which is about $1,000 for an average worker, and that's good, certainly better than not doing anything. And we will also do the unemployment insurance, but only for half the time that the President suggested. And here's the kicker. All of that will not be paid by those who earn more than $1 million, the millionaires and billionaires. That will be paid for by the middle class. It was the 99%ers that were going to have to pay for this, not the 1%ers, but the 99%ers. It was the great shell game, and a very, very sad day. Fortunately, the President said, I will veto that if it ever gets to my desk, and the Senate has said, no way, this is not fair to the working men and women of America. Now, we were here and we heard some of the debate. Share with us your thoughts about all that went on yesterday and that rather sad piece of legislation.
Well, again, it's like a teeter-totter. You know, it's like it's tipped in one direction.
Yeah.
And I think everybody in our country knows that we all will have to sacrifice in order to pay down our long-term debt, and that when we make public decisions, that we help our economy grow. Every business that I go into, they say, Marcy, bring me customers. Bring me customers. The advantage of helping the middle class, whether they're out of work and they receive unemployment benefits which they have earned, or whether it is allowing an individual through a payroll tax holiday to have a few extra dollars of spending money, that is going to go directly into our economy. It goes to every small business, whether it's to buy vegetables at the corner stand, whether it's to buy gasoline for your car, whether it's to buy clothing for your children. When you think about where those dollars will go, it's going to go to essentials, not, it won't be wasted money. And all of history shows us that the middle class, because their incomes have really not gone up, buying power has gone down for the average family, and prices are going up. They're guarding every penny so much more carefully. I had to go out and buy some throw rugs the other day because of all of the rain in the Midwest that had caused water to rise in our basement, and I couldn't believe the price of throw rugs. I thought, oh my goodness. And I went to 2 or 3 stores. I don't have time to do that. But I thought, how... I was reacting to the increase in prices. And the average family has great difficulty in buying those kinds of items. So those few hundreds of dollars mean everything, and they will use it to improve their home, for example. Yes,
If I might
Congressman.
interrupt for just a moment, you raised a very, very important point about the fate of the American middle class and the extraordinary benefit that has grown to the top 1%. This is where the 99% comes in. Let me just show you this chart. It's become one of my favorites. And this chart is about the growth of income. Down here in the bottom are the bottom 99% of Americans and the income that they have seen over the last, since 1979. Virtually no real growth in the income of the working men and women, the middle class of America. So if you look at these lines, this is the top quartile, this is the middle quartile, and the bottom quartile here. No growth, just a little tiny growth. And incidentally, most of that comes because now both the husband and wife are working, not because just one of the wage earners has seen it. This top line, Marcy, is the 1%ers. We can see that over the last 25, 30 years, the 1%ers have done very, very nicely. And there are many reasons for this. One, they're very productive. They've been able to find good opportunities and make the most of it, and we wouldn't deny anybody that opportunity to become very, very wealthy in America, if they play by the rules. And I know a little later you're going to talk about some that have not played by the rules and have become extraordinarily wealthy. But if you play by the rules, you ought to be able to do very well in America. But what we're talking about here is tax fairness. A lot of this growth right here in the last decade was a direct result of tax policy. The George W. Bush tax cuts for the super wealthy that were supposed to create jobs didn't create jobs. In fact, we had a loss of employment in the United States. Even if you discount and take out the great crash of 2007-8, in the George Bush era, the argument for reducing the high-income tax rate was it would create jobs because these were the job creators. Didn't create jobs. Did not create jobs. So now we're talking about how do we keep this economy going? How do we provide for those that don't have a job? How do we put money back into the economy? As you say, it'll be spent. Well, we do it with tax fairness, and that is, as the President suggested, that for those people who earn more than $1 million a year, after all their deductions, that amount of income above $1 million would be taxed an additional 3.5%. That's fair. That's fair to the American workers so that they can, if they're unemployed or if they're looking for a job, they'll have an opportunity.
You know, Congressman Garamendi, I was thinking as you were talking at that chart that shows the flatness of income growth in the middle class, and thinking about the last several years of our U.S. trade deficits. Thank you so much. And probably most Americans don't realize it, but annually we rack up about $500 billion, over $500 billion more imports coming into our country than exports going out. And it hits the working class, the middle class of people very, very hard because it substitutes for the income that they would normally earn if they were manufacturing in this country as many cars as they used to. And what we see happening is we see a tipping toward the top, but really all sectors are affected by the fact that our trade deficit lops off most of the GDP, the gross domestic product growth, every year, $500 billion bleeding out of our economy. Thank you so much for purchases of everything from electronics to energy, to automobiles that should be made inside this country, is a huge downdraft on every income quartile in our country. Thus, your efforts to promote American-made goods are right on target.
Before we go back to Make It in America, which is our principal policy, at least among those of us that are talking about the Make It in America agenda, I want to just make it very clear that this debate over the payroll tax deduction or reduction and the unemployment insurance is not over. We've got a little bit of time to get this done before the end of the year, when all of these opportunities for people to continue to survive terminate. Right now, the Senate is going to take up the House bill, and it's our understanding that that bill is not going to move in the Senate. We need to get past this gamesmanship that we saw in the legislation that passed here just yesterday and get serious about finding a compromise that can deal with this problem. Here's our wish list. This is the American wish list. We have Santa up here, but let's just say it's to the House of Representatives, all of us, and to the Senate. And what we would like to have in the stocking is not a bad lump of coal, but rather a payroll tax cut extension. At least, and we could probably settle for the present. If we want to compromise, we wanted 3%, but we can settle for the 2% reduction. That's $1,000 in the pocket of every working man, woman, and child, no, not child, but every man and woman in the state. It's 160 million people. That's an enormous thing for us to do. And so this is one of the things that we would wish would happen, that we would do, your representatives, Democrat and Republican alike, and the senators, that we would do this for the working men and women of America so that they can have food on their table and a roof over them. The other deals with the unemployment insurance. 5.7 million people are going to be losing their unemployment insurance in the coming year. What in the world are they going to do? The jobs are not there, as you so clearly pointed out, Ms. Kaptur. The jobs are not there. They need help, and that's where the unemployment insurance program will help them and simultaneously help the economy, as Ms. Kaptur pointed out. And we can pay for this. We can pay for this with a fair tax system in America.
You know, I wanted to just comment obliquely here based on what you've been talking about, but looking at job creation in a given region, if I look at the regions that I've been privileged to represent, we have many small companies or medium-sized companies. I happened to be speaking with one of them the other day, Hirzel, H-I-R-Z-E-L, which is a major producer of tomato products in our region. And I said, you know, I was looking for your spaghetti sauce on the shelves of one of our major grocery chains, and I couldn't find it. And it's the best spaghetti sauce I've ever eaten. I said, how can I help you expand your product's placement on the shelves of stores across our country? And the owner of the company, a family-owned company, they're the most wonderful people, he said to me, well, you don't really understand, Marcy. He said, we really aren't allowed on those shelves because one of the big spaghetti sauce manufacturers, and I won't mention the name, pays the grocery store a fee to keep all new products off their shelves. And even though Hirzel's is not a new product, it's regionally bound, and they can't get on the shelves of supermarkets because of what's called slotting fees.
You know, we should work together. Excuse me for interrupting, but in my district, we have a ravioli company. They make, I mean, we're talking about out of the world. Now, maybe your sauce on top of their raviolis, we could actually get on the shelf.
Well, you know what? These large outfits that control retail sales in our country hurt innovation. Because what they do is they make deals with some of the biggest companies. Ask yourself why, when you go through a supermarket and you want to find soda pop, they call it soda pop in some places, and they call it, what do they call it in your part of the country?
Well, it's obesity.
Oh, well, if you try to find different brands, you'll see certain brands at eye level because they pay thousands of dollars to each grocery store to put it there. But if you want locally bottled soda or pop, you're lucky if you can find it on the bottom shelf, and you probably can't. So what we have like gatekeepers. The public is largely unaware of this. Local meat. I represent a region that is both urban and rural. I love it. I'm privileged to represent it. Try to get locally produced pork on the shelves of large supermarket chains. Good luck. You know, the same is true with vegetables. We could have so much more income growth and job growth in this country if we would have some consciousness by these big retailers and box stores to go local. We grow local, we make local, but then to try to move it to shelf, it's almost impossible.
But Black Friday, a week ago, all about the big retailers. But Small Saturday, now that was exciting. A lot of advertising out in California about go to your local shop, buy local, buy small. And it was just what you're talking about, and that is to find a way to provide opportunity, moving, in this case, customers, to the local stores. Instead of the big box store, go down Main Street, stop at the local shop. Very, very powerful. And I don't know, I suspect that many of us did that. We stopped at the local store and we didn't go down to Home Depot, we went down to the Ace Hardware.